so much for having me on Law and Liberation. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Ragini Shah, and I am a professor at Suffolk University Law School, where I run the Immigrant Justice Clinic. And the work of the Immigrant Justice Clinic is to support community-based organizations in their efforts to try to improve conditions for immigrant communities. And that includes a range of things, which I'm sure we'll talk about later in this program, but it includes basically trying to help people help themselves and provide some legal support for people who are trying to do that.
Great. So before we dive into the pressing issues today, I think one of the things that I found is that there's a lot of misunderstanding about broadly the topic of immigration. So I was wondering if you can start with perhaps correcting a few misunderstandings that the public may have about terms, getting a kind of common vocabulary. For example, asylee, refugee, immigrant, non-immigrant, illegal, legal. I feel like these terms oftentimes determine policy.
Absolutely. So one thing in terms of terminology that gets used that I think is important to understand is, I think we could even start with the basic term immigrant and, what is meant by immigrant. People use that term so loosely to refer to really dozens of legal categories. And I think, one of the basic things that I want to make sure people understand is that the category you are in, when you're not a citizen of the US, the category you're in at any given moment can change. So you could, for example, have a visa when you enter the country as a tourist. But if you overstay that visa, now you become unauthorized, right? I think what the administration would call an illegal immigrant. But that can change again because that person could fall in love with the US citizen and get married, and then they would be eligible for a green card based on that marriage. And so I think this kind of changeability is maybe getting lost in just using the term immigrant. Some of the other terms that I think people have a hard time understanding are terms like asylee, refugee. So, asylum is one of US's international obligations. We have to accept people who are fleeing persecution in their home countries. We don't have options of deciding, oh no, we decided today we're not going to do that. And, I think what people fail to understand is many people that this administration are calling unlawful, or their term is illegal, are actually people applying for asylum. So they're in a legal process. Again, going back to this understanding that immigration categories can change. So when you enter the country, let's say you flee suddenly and you cross into the United States without any visa, okay, you've entered unlawfully. But if you fleed, then you're probably eligible for asylum. And if you're applying for asylum, you're in the process of changing that unlawful status to a lawful status. So I think that's the basic thing that I think people might want to walk away with.
Great, thank you. So related to that, what are three myths? I'm sure there are more, but about immigration law that you as a scholar, practitioner, advocate would want to dispel?
Yeah, so I think there are so many myths about immigration, but I think the three main myths that I would want to dispel. The first one comes directly from research that I did for a book that I wrote that came out last year, and is available, by the way, open source. So I'm happy to provide a link. But the first myth, I think, is that immigrants want to come to the US. What I learned in my research, and this is something that you hear from immigrant communities all the time, is that in fact, immigration, particularly immigration where the person doesn't have a visa before they come is really a last resort. And it's a last resort for people who are fleeing from violence, but it is also a last resort for people who are trying to help their families survive. So the economic conditions in a lot of the places that people are coming from have been created to make it impossible for a person to survive and for their children to, you know, eat, have sufficient clothing, have healthcare, et cetera. So I think that would be the number one myth that I would want to dispel. The second myth, I think, it that is important to dispel is that immigrants take resources. They take jobs, they take public benefits, et cetera. And here, it's really interesting because actually the complete reverse is true. Um, in fact, immigrants contribute about $300 billion to the US economy annually, which is a huge chunk of the US economy. And maybe even more importantly, if you are somebody like, let's say you ate fruit this morning for breakfast, think about the shirt that you're wearing right now. Think about the sidewalk you walked on the way to work or school or wherever. It's very likely that an immigrant had something to do with that fruit making it to your table, that shirt making it on your body, and that sidewalk being repaired. And also very likely, and I think Professor Huck, you know this better than I do, also very likely is that the person who's doing that labor is probably facing a lot of really horrible workplace conditions, right? They're underpaid, they're overworked. The conditions, like the natural conditions as well as created conditions, are pretty horrible. So that's and I think the other part of that myth that needs to get busted is if you have a parent or a grandparent who is on Medicare as their health insurance or who gets Social Security benefits, the reality is the only reason that we have funds in those particular parts of the budget to give people benefits is because undocumented immigrants, people who lack legal status, make it a priority to get a tax ID number so that they can pay into those systems. So it is their money that is keeping Social Security and Medicare payments going to US citizens and other people with legal status. So in fact, the very opposite of taking resources, immigrants are in fact contributing resources, way more than they take. The last myth I think that's important to dispel is that immigrants are criminals or that they, commit crimes at high rates. And here again, there's a factual reality, but I think there's also a deeper reality. The factual reality is that immigrants commit crimes at a way lower rate than US citizens. This is including people who are lawfully here and here without status. There are statistics actually that Congress has in front of them from a study done in Texas that shows that immigrants of all statuses are arrested at less than half the rate of US citizens. So that's the reality, right? But I think what's interesting to me is why is this reality and the other realities I talked about so difficult to absorb? And I think it's because there's something deeper and there's a foundational myth that we have in the US about who is a criminal and what actions get criminalized. So imagine, for example, people listening to this probably heard that an ICE agent killed someone in a Chicago suburb recently, right? People have probably seen the videos of ICE agents breaking in the windows of people's cars in order to arrest them. Now, imagine if an immigrant engaged in those actions, right? Imagine if an immigrant killed somebody or an immigrant broke somebody's window to kidnap them. We would consider those very serious crimes. But the reality is when law enforcement engages in that same kind of criminal activity, that those actions are legitimized. And so I think there's something deeper here about criminalization that I think we all need to grapple with as a country.
Thank you. And we're going to come to a question about the intersection of criminal law and immigration, as well as your book, Constructed Movements. So before we get to that, you know, to understand kind of how we got to this moment, can you give us a very top line sketch as to the immigration laws and particularly kind of what is legal, what is not, and what preceded the Trump administration. Because one of the often sort of narrative is that, Trump came in and sort of ramped up, sort of deportation. But, what was the legal sort of structure before the immigration laws that existed then that enables this aggressive criminal type of law enforcement by ICE agents?
Yeah, so the legal structure that exists that kind of allows for the Trump administration to engage in this extremely stepped up enforcement. The legal foundation was laid for that, I would say, all the way back even to the 1970s. But definitely in the 1980s, you see laws that start to form and decisions by the Supreme Court that start to allow ICE agents to engage in enforcement in particular ways. So ICE agents are allowed to approach anybody and ask about their status, right? That's in the laws. They're also allowed to detain someone when they find that the person is without status. Anyone who lacks immigration status, either because they entered unlawfully and are not in some kind of legal process, or because they overstayed their visa, can be arrested in this way, right? And that's something that has existed in the law way before the Trump administration. The question has always been about the approach. Is a particular Congress or presidential administration going to try to arrest every single person who might lack legal status at a particular moment? Again, keeping in mind that these legal statuses are changeable, right? Or are they going to start to think about, well, wait a minute, if we need people's labor, maybe we should legalize this workforce, right? Or if we know that people are coming to reunite with their families, maybe we need to figure out a pathway for that. So it's really about the approach, but the legal foundation for engaging these kinds of arrests was laid. Now, I know we're going to talk a little bit later about the recent Supreme Court decision on this, but even before the Supreme Court recently sort of signaled that they're okay with racial profiling, you know, immigration agents have always, I've been working as an immigration lawyer for 20 years, immigration agents have always thought that they are allowed to racially profile. They have always taken that position. And, their sort of narrative is, well, the majority of people who lack status are from Mexico and Central America. So, of course, that is a basis on which to stop somebody. But I think that the problem with their narrative is, one, that alone cannot be a basis for stopping someone. And that does seem to be something the Trump administration is doing now, using race alone as a factor. And secondly, the other thing immigration agents think that they can do now, which I think is different than before, is earlier agents would recognize the boundary of, okay, I can stop and ask somebody questions, but if they refuse to answer, I've got to move on because I don't really have a basis for arresting them. Now, I think the Trump administration has really taken off the wheels and seems to be training agents to approach people and immediately arrest them, regardless of whether the person says they're from outside the US or not. And that, I think, is really something that is new and is resulting in a lot of arrests of people who are applying for status, have status. Even US citizens have been picked up in these raids. And so I think that's something that is new and is being challenged. And unfortunately, it looks like the Supreme Court is kind of signaling that they're going to be okay with it.
Actually, it's probably a good moment to talk about the recent Supreme Court decision in Nome versus Perdomo. Like, what was the issue, and what did the court hold, and what are some concerns that from the movement, social movement perspective, that we should be attuned to?
Absolutely. So I first want to say, with the new decision, not to overstate its importance, because it is kind of a preliminary decision. And also, I think always, as we're talking about how law can serve social movements, we're always using these negative decisions that are, kind of dampening the rights of people as a starting point, right? So there's still always ways to challenge these things. However, what the Supreme Court seemed to signal, and actually it was just Justice Kavanaugh, Justice Kavanaugh signaled that the Supreme Court is likely to be okay with ICE agents using race as a factor in stopping and arresting people. And he used sort of a long line of cases that talk about how Border Patrol agents might be able to use race as a factor. But of course, conditions at the border are different than in the interior of the United States. So there's a little bit of haziness there. I think the Supreme Court is starting to, blur the line between the border and the interior of the US. And so in effect, they're sort of making the border everywhere in the US for people who are not US citizens or might get stopped by ICE because they're considered to not be US citizens. And the other thing I think that is really problematic is the lawsuit came out of the massive arrests in Los Angeles, in which ICE agents used a lot of brutality and violence. And that is something that you see in the way that they've been acting in a lot of other cities as well. And so the judge in Los Angeles or in the Central District of California was looking at those acts and determined that, one, the tactics that they used meant that they really didn't determine anything specific about the person before they arrested them. They were just rounding people up, like beating them, like pulling them into vans, etc., without really knowing anything about each person. And that was what the judge in the Central District of California took issue with. Kavanaugh kind of glosses over that and acts like this is just a casual encounter where the ICE agent goes up to somebody and they're allowed to do that. And they ask a question and they get an answer. And then, if they get an answer that the person's US citizen, they let them go. That's not what was happening on the ground. And so I think the other thing that is important for movements is that these things have to be documented. They have to continue to be documented because that is the only way that we're going to be able to really move the narrative on what is happening. That this is a campaign of racialized violence and not about immigration enforcement.
Powerful. One thing I wanted you to elaborate, which I thought was a really kind of novel point that I haven't heard, is this idea that this administration is blurring the lines of the border and interior. And we're going to talk about the deployment of the National Guard for ICE enforcement, which I think, indicates that. But just as a principle, could you just say a little bit more about what do you mean when you're talking about border and the interior, and what does immigration law make that distinction?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just say a little bit more about this distinction between the border and the interior. The border has kind of a, unfortunately, very unique place in our laws. And so people have less rights at the border. So, for example, even US citizens can be searched without a warrant. Now, this is all contested, right? But the way the law is right now, that is, what the decisions have said. The other thing that comes up a lot is that, in immigration law, there's this idea of the fiction that a person who entered the country without authorization is considered to always be at the border, right? And so what the Trump administration is doing is kind of taking that concept and putting it on steroids. And so I think what they're pushing, honestly, is this idea that for anyone who lacks authorization, they're always at the border, regardless if they're in like Kansas or Chicago or wherever they are. And that means that the protections of the Constitution don't apply to them. And so, they're trying to do this in a number of different ways, and I'm happy to get into more details. But basically, I think what people need to understand is they're moving laws, but they're also not even necessarily taking the trouble to change laws. They are just acting in ways that on the ground make it so that ICE agents believe that if they're encountering someone who they think entered unlawfully, they can act like they're at the border.
Yeah, it makes sense in terms of his first administration around the Muslim ban, where Customs and Border Patrol felt emboldened to like do whatever. It really gives a lot of discretion. Um, I wanted to talk about, you mentioned the criminality as a myth, and you've worked in this area called, at the intersection of criminal law and immigration. Can you talk briefly about what that is? And you did a little bit in your talk, and speak about how you were able to challenge the use of gang affiliation as a basis for denying immigration relief.
Yeah, so one of the things I talked about before was this idea of criminality and who is a criminal, what is criminal behavior, that often gets defined in ways that are really racialized, right? And so my clinic, for a long time, focused on cases at the intersection of criminal and immigration law, which is known as for immigration. One of the cases that we had was for a young man who was accused of being a member of MS-13, which is a gang that started in the US and is very active in El Salvador. And the allegations that he was a gang member were based on things like he wore particular color clothing, he was seen in the company of people who, again, were verified gang members. Verification as a gang member, what we learned, is essentially based on a point system, and that can include a number of things that are protected First Amendment activity, like walking around with friends, right? Or writing things in your school notebook that the police officers decide are gang related. And also can be based on arrest. So our client was arrested. Once he was arrested because he was carrying a tool he needed for work, and the officer thought that it was a weapon, and so he was arrested for that. And so there were so many elements of this case that were really about who gets arrested for things, right? Who gets targeted and is seen as a gang member. And ultimately, we brought in a law enforcement expert who talked about this point system that's used to verify gang members, who basically said this point system is like not credible. It's not a legitimate way to determine gang membership. And we were able to convince the immigration judge because of that the allegations were not sufficient to deny our client a green card. And so what was really gratifying was that we were able to get our client a green card, which he sorely needed. That this is a young man who faced a lot of violence in El Salvador himself. That's the reason he came to the US. And he had a hard time after he got here. And he had some mental health issues. And so, it was really important for him to be able to get that stability of a green card, to be able to move on with his life, get the treatment he needed, for his mother to feel like, she didn't have to visit her son in a detention center. But it takes a lot of effort to overcome this idea of criminality because it's so entrenched, I guess, in our psyches.
We're seeing a bit of that now with the unsubstantiated allegations of gang affiliation and horrific instances of actual deportation. And so, could you speak a little bit about how you're seeing that show up in currently, and then, yeah, and then we'll shift to kind of strategies to combat.
Yeah, these allegations, particularly of gang membership, are being used a lot in the current day. So, for example, people probably know that the Trump administration categorized a gang in Venezuela as being a foreign entity that was invading the United States. And so they tried to use the what's called the Alien and Sedition Act to deport those folks summarily, really without any hearing on which they could refute the allegations that they were a gang member, or even more importantly, that this gang, supposed gang, is a foreign entity that's invading the United States, right? So, they're really the problem with gang allegations is that they can be made on very little evidence, and they can be made based on evidence that's racially coded. And so, basically anyone who's brown can be a member of a gang. Anyone who's brown or black can be seen as a member of a gang. And so that's why I keep saying that, we really need to grapple, I think, with some of the ways in which racializing people has created these categories that are just so amorphous and really hard to refute. And so, but also equally hard for the government to prove. It's just that they don't have to do a lot to prove these allegations in the eyes of some judges. And so, so it can result in really horrific consequences, like the Venezuelan men who were sent to CICOT in El Salvador, and we saw how they were brutalized there. And now the administration is trying to expand the categories of people that they can do this with, essentially make MS-13 a terrorist group. So that means even less ability to refute the allegations, and even more ability for the administration to take a person and send them to whatever country is willing to accept them, Rwanda, Libya, wherever. So it's really becoming problematic. And, to the earlier point, it didn't start with the Trump administration. There's a lot of things we have to undo that really started in this earlier, like 1970s, 1980s era.
Great. So now I want to turn to what communities can do to defend against all of these sort of immigration enforcement onslaught. What are some examples that you're seeing that you can speak about? You mentioned earlier about documentation. Obviously, your clinic is doing direct representation, but you also work with community groups. So what are some strategies to combat that communities can challenge this enforcement?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of strategies that communities have been using to challenge and resist this kind of onslaught of enforcement. And I think one actually example that just happened yesterday is communities organizing to create hotlines and to create a group of allies who can go and document if an ICE arrest is occurring. And so in Massachusetts, we have a group called LUCE, LUCE, which is a hotline. And it's really become an organizing tool as well, because what happens is there are mostly white US citizen allies who are trained to verify that an ICE arrest is taking place. But what these verifiers have also been able to do is they go and document. So just yesterday, there was a man who went to verify, and he was filming the ICE agents in the meantime, contacted other verifiers to come, and eventually there was a group of like 30 people confronting these ICE agents with their phone cameras, with questions about what were they doing, what's the basis of this arrest. And even though this person was in their car, which is a very vulnerable place to be, right? They've got two ICE cars like surrounding them, and they're in their car. Eventually, they had to let the person drive away because there was just so much community pressure. So I think just like organizing, being able to have that kind of response is really important. I think also for those of us who are lawyers, being ready to file the kind of necessary legal documents if a person is detained quickly, because things move very quickly now in immigration court and in federal court. And also taking on some challenges. So I think one of the things that I'm trying to work on with other folks in Massachusetts is figuring out what are some ways that cities and states can challenge the federal government's ability to engage in this kind of enforcement. How do we challenge the abuses of our neighbors there's a lot of like legal obstacles there, but hopefully we'll be able to come up with some creative legal strategies.
Are there strategies that communities can use without the, reliance on lawyers because there's not enough lawyers around. Lawyers can be expensive. Can you list some examples that how communities have been sort of through mutual aid or other efforts been able to confront this ICE enforcement?
Yeah, so some of the strategies that communities use, aside from the legal strategies, are getting up to date on knowing the rights that community members have, knowing the process, right? So understanding what happens when a person gets detained, I think is super important, so that community members themselves can intervene, and potentially by knowing the person's rights and sort of shouting the person's rights as things are happening, can potentially stop an arrest from happening in the first place. But even if they can't do that, they can get in the information that's necessary to make sure that they follow that person and help them, support them, so that people don't feel the need to, sign a piece of paper that says, yeah, I'm just going to be put on a flight wherever ICE decides to send me. People are also organizing sort of community patrols, organizing things like bringing people meals who feel like they don't want to leave the house, helping walk children to school, helping, carpool to work, or, walk together, take the train together to work. So all of these things, it's like really just about coming together and being there for each other so that, your people are not alone facing 6, 7, 8 law enforcement agents.
Just wanted to get your thoughts about the administration's use of National Guards for ICE enforcement. It seems that it's being selectively used in states that are, or cities that are considered sanctuary cities, but just maybe some comment about that.
Yeah, so I think, the administration has started to use the National Guard, as I'm sure people know, to engage in immigration enforcement. And I think the reason they're doing that is to really push this narrative that immigrants are invaders, right? That they need to be met with military. And I also think it's a complete violation of our laws because you're not supposed to be sending US military against people in the US. We could talk about whether it's appropriate outside the US too, but you're not, I mean, legally, there's a doctrine known as posse comitatus, which is essentially the idea that US military should not be deployed against people in the US. And the Trump administration is really pushing that. And they're sort of, this goes back again to this idea of everywhere is the border, right? They're basically using the National Guard to push this idea that, well, when it comes to immigrants, they're not really in the US, so we're going to, we can use the National Guard.
Great. So I want to just before I, sort of slowly sort of wind down, which has been an amazing conversation, is I really appreciated your point about grappling with racialized violence through the immigration enforcement. Concretely, what could that look like on the ground for social movement activists or lawyers? Like, how do we challenge, this racialized violence that you're talking about? Because I agree with you, it sort of underpins so much of the actions.
Yeah, so I think, challenging the racialized violence has to take on a number of different methods. And I do think one way of challenging it is by bringing legal challenges to the actions of in law enforcement. And I really think, the Black Lives Matter movement obviously did this in its push to hold police officers accountable for violence against the Black community in particular by police, and resulted in at least one successful prosecution of a law enforcement official. I think holding agents accountable legally is one part of it. I also think that every time I talk to a reporter, and I know that a lot of like organizers talk to reporters, we try to help them understand that their questions about, well, did this person commit any crimes? Like, is the brutality justified because this person committed a crime? We try to help people understand that, that's not really the right question to be asking. Like, nothing justifies these acts of brutality. When you're talking about state actors who have state issued weapons that we're paying for, who are engaging in violence against people that they're supposed to be protecting. So we really need to kind of shift the narrative, I think, more largely. And then I think, with social movements, I feel like there's a lot of really great movements talking about why it's important to move resources away from things that are harmful to things that are helpful. And I really do think, I know people, have this kind of immediate reaction to terms like abolition and things like that, but I think it may be helpful to kind of understand what is meant by that. What we're really talking about is we want our resources to go to schools, we want them to go to housing, we want them to go to healthcare, and not to beefing up the ability of law enforcement to brutalize us. And unfortunately, I think the Trump administration is providing us an example of the exact opposite, right? I mean, they're engaging in the abolition of healthcare and housing and education funding in favor of enforcement. So I guess maybe the takeaway is, well, if they can do that, we can do it the other way. And I think there's a lot of groups that are in the process of trying to push for the other way.
In this framing, how do you see the push against birthright citizenship? Just
Yeah,
briefly.
so I
I know
think
it's its own discussion, but it seems to fit into what you were saying about this kind of form of like racialized sort of immigration violence.
Yeah, so I think birthrights, I think the push to challenge birthright citizenship definitely fits in to the overarching theme of racialized violence, because the idea is that to take away the ability of people to have some sort of stability, right? Understand that, well, if a child is born here, they will be a US citizen. Like, there's been a kind of stability around that for many decades. And taking that stability away really puts a lot of people on edge. And I think that's part of the goal of the administration. But I think it is also a demographic issue, because the majority of people who are born in the US today to non-citizen parents are people of color. And so that is eventually going to change the demographics of the United States. And I think that's the racial part, right? There's a lot of anxiety on the right about the US becoming less white. And, there's any number of people that we could cite to for this. But that's a real anxiety that they have. And they're engaging in every legal tool they can manufacture to try to prevent that from happening. And I think part of the fight to reclaim the narrative about birthright citizenship is really talking about this point about what it is for. It's for stability. It's not, I guess I don't know what else to say about it. Yeah, it's for stability.
So I want to turn now to your research and your book. You've looked at migration between US and Mexico, done research. What are some lessons, maybe key lessons and takeaway from your research that might be valuable to social movement activists and lawyers?
Yeah, so I think the research that I did for my book also informs the way that I think about social movements. And I think I get this question about lessons learned from the social movements in Mexico for organizing in the US. And I think it is a really good question, because I think that organizing in Mexico is obviously a little bit different, because what communities they're organizing for are more resources so that people do not have to migrate. But it has a lot of connection to what people are organizing for here. Because I think there are communities obviously organizing for more resources so that their lives can be better here. It's maybe not the same narrative about so people can't migrate. But I think one of the key lessons is that there's communities in Mexico that I visited and worked with who've been organizing for more resources for decades, right? And I think part of it is a long arc. You really have to stay focused on the issues, build, so that more people come into the movement. One of the other lessons is that the organizing in Mexico was primarily done by men until a group of women started to come back from the US with experience, migration in the US and experience with some labor organizing in the US. And then they started to kind of make inroads, and it really expanded the group. And, so organizing in ways that are expansive but remain focused on the end goal, and not being dissuaded or discouraged because you have losses. The groups I spoke with had a lot of losses. They didn't get funding for years and years and years and years until they finally did. They're still fighting those fights to get resources. And so it's has to be a sort of a lifetime commitment. And I think the last thing I'll say is that the kinds of things that the organizers in Mexico did to remain sustained in their work, a lot of like cultural events, gatherings, finding joy in things, that was also really important. And I think something that I know a lot of groups here are trying to do as well, as you face so many different things that are destabilizing.
Yeah, and we hope in this series to actually talk with, cultural workers. As a scholar, lawyer, activist, organizer, are there any points that you want to maybe kind of emphasize as we close out this interview, particularly to this the political moment that we are in the United States? If you want to speak also sort of transnationally, but sort of like one key takeaway. I know it's hard, yeah.
Yeah, so I think I think the one key takeaway, if people want to take anything away from this conversation, is that when you hear the word immigrant, right, I think it's just important for people to reflect on what is the image that they're seeing, what is the ideas that come to mind about that term, and where did that come from? I think it has become such an insult almost to call somebody an immigrant. And, the reality is so many of us, our parents are immigrants, our, grandparents, whoever, but even beyond that, I think we have to really be clear that, like, this is a country that was created through colonialism, and that continues to be the case. So when you hear the term immigrant being kind of thrown around, like, what does that really mean? Like, we're a colonial country, and colonialism requires movement of people. And so criminalizing them at the same time, the only people that serves is the elites. So, just trying to kind of figure out like where you are in this understanding of what immigration is, I think is a good first step.
Great. So last question, in our effort through this series to co-create a sort of vocabulary around liberation, I ask you and all guests, what does liberation look like to you? What does it mean to you? How would you define it?
Yeah, what is liberation to me is such a great question. It's such a big question, right? And I think the baseline for me is liberation means that people have enough. People have what they need to be healthy, to be housed, to be clothed, to be fed, and also that people have the ability to make decisions for themselves and their communities. So I really take a lot from the organizers I worked with in Mexico because their entire struggle, mostly they're indigenous peoples in Mexico, and their entire struggle is for self-determination, really the ability to decide how their land and their own labor is going to be used for their benefit. And I think that's something that, yeah, I really think about when I think about liberation.
Great. Thank you so much. At the end, we'll put a link to your book, which you mentioned is open source, so constructed movements and I appreciate so much you taking the time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.